Good afternoon and welcome to Re-engage in Trade, Climate Change and the Implications for International Trade on this Earth Day 2021. And my name is Stella Sheehan and I'm the Deputy Director here at the World Trade Center St. Louis. Thank you all for taking time to join us this afternoon for this very timely topic on an April day in St. Louis when we just had snow a few days ago. We are thrilled to partner this afternoon with a member of our World Trade Centers Association family, the World Trade Center Winnipeg in Canada, to bring you today's event. The theme for Earth Day 2021 is Restore Our Earth, which focuses on natural processes, emerging green technologies, and innovative thinking that can restore the world's ecosystems. You can take heart from the fact that you are now part of the more than 1 billion people, that's right, I did say billion, in 192 countries who participate in Earth Day activities each year, making it the largest civic observance in the world. So just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. You will be muted for the duration of the presentation. However, if you wish to ask questions, please do so via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. We will do our best to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Tim Nowak. Tim has led the World Trade Center for over 13 years, bringing years of international business experience in Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and South America. He is a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow, a proud Mizzou grad, and I should mention for the benefit of our speaker, an avid blues fan. So really, I'm just hoping that we get through this presentation with these two still speaking. So with that, here's hoping, and over to you, Tim.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Stella. And congratulations to you and to your team on organizing today's events with our friends from Winnipeg. Like the World Trade Center St. Louis, WTC Winnipeg is a leader in supporting trade development and global connections for their business community. They have a fantastic team led by their president and CEO, Myriad, who also serves as vice chair of the World Trade Center Association Board of Directors based in New York City. Now, Myriad was kind enough to record a short greeting, so let's hear from her now.
Bonjour. Hello, I'm Mariette Muller, President and CEO of the World Trade Center Winnipeg, right in the middle of Canada. I just wanted to congratulate the World Trade Center St. Louis for this great initiative of how to re-engage in trade in the series with climate change and how that's affecting trade. So I love seeing these kinds of collaboration as the vice chair of the World Trade Center Association to see how our family, our big family, can get together and share ideas and share knowledge. I think that's exactly what our whole network is about. And today we have our Vice President, Derek Earle, who will be part of this whole series. He's been doing a lot of research on this subject, and he can certainly share with you today his knowledge and what he's learned along the way. So I wish you a great event, and thank you very much for involving World Trade Center Winnipeg.
That's terrific. Thank you, Mariette. We appreciate those kind words very much. Now, unlike my admiration and long-standing respect for Mariette, it is now my duty, if you would call it, to introduce their number two at the WTC Winnipeg, and that's Derek Earle. Now, see, Derek and I, as Stella had mentioned, we have this long-standing love-hate relationship, largely centered around hockey, which, Derek, if memory serves, the Blues ousted the Winnipeg Jets in 2019 from the playoffs on the way to their first Stanley Cup, if I'm not mistaken. Remind me again, how many Stanley Cups the Winnipeg Jets have? That's, yeah.
Working on it.
Think about that while I finish your introduction. Think about that. All right, all joking aside, Derek is a good friend. We've known each other for a number of years, and we have a lot of respect for him. And we're certainly grateful to have him here with us today. He is Vice President of the World Trade Center Winnipeg, overseeing international trade strategy and operations for the organization. He has been instrumental in a number of key projects, including the establishment and launching of the World Trade Center in Winnipeg in 2013, and organizing Centralia Global Business Forum, which has brought hundreds of business leaders from around the world to Winnipeg every 2 years since 2010. He leads the WTC Winnipeg's Northern and Arctic trade development strategies. He's also very active in developing the organization's trade development strategies with the United States, connecting the WTC Winnipeg to the small business networks of the Americas. Prior to joining the WTC, Derek worked with the Canadian Embassy in Paris, France, where he established the province of Ontario's Trade Development Investment Attraction Office. He's a native of Winnipeg, and his education includes a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from the University of Manitoba and a Master of Arts in International Politics from the University of Ottawa. Derek, we're certainly pleased to have you here with us today, and so thanks for doing this, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, for the kind introduction. Delighted to be here. 2 years on, I'm kind of over the blues of the harsh defeat and sort of ready to re-engage now on trade. But thank you so much. I love our relationship and great to be working together. I'm just going to pull up our presentation here to get started. So climate change is in the news kind of virtually daily these days, globally, locally. What does it mean? What does it mean for business? How is it affecting trade? How does it affect your business, and how might it affect your business? I've actually become quite fascinated by this question over the last few years, and been doing a lot of research, working with our business community and with clients. And the answer is that it's actually quite disruptive. There's a lot happening right now in response to climate change. That we'll get into some of this today. So I'll just send a big thanks to Tim and Stella with your team at the World Trade Center, St. Louis. Again, delighted to be here and collaborating with you as part of your Re-Engage in Trade series. We're gonna introduce a few ideas, some concepts, some things that we're watching, and hopefully give you some things that as a business you can maybe look at or apply or consider as you go forward. And then we'll have a good discussion. So look forward to hearing the questions coming from the audience. Climate change is one of these topics that often leads to some rather heated debates sometimes, this kind of environment versus the economy. And so, as I said, we're just going to touch on a few concepts today, but there's some interesting things happening on particularly the economic side that point to some ways around green technology and innovation and new business opportunity and trade opportunities that are interesting and excited. And this kind of older paradigm of economy versus the environment, I'm not sure it applies so much. There's ways we can look at sort of economic opportunity and prosperity that's also seen to have benefits for the environment. So that's some interesting developments. But our focus in terms of the work we do at the World Trade Center is we're here to support the business community and help advise on strategies to be successful with international business. So what does the business owner need to know about climate change? And that's really kind of the framework that we bring towards looking at this question. And also, when we talk about climate change, there's climate change, the science, and I'm not a climate scientist. I'll be clear about that. But there's climate change, kind of what I refer to as the business issue. Again, what does it mean for companies? What does the CEO need to know about climate change, or what should we be thinking about? And really, the key thing, if there's a concept to take and apply around this, it's all about this framework of risk and opportunity. What are maybe new and changing or different risks that might apply to my business, my business model? But also, what are the new opportunities out there as the economy evolves and responds to what's happening on this front? And we're going to talk about both of those things today. Briefly, as mentioned, I'm with the World Trade Center Winnipeg. So our key services that we offer is that we have a team of business and trade advisors that work one-on-one with the company, advising, providing market research, helping with export plans and strategies. We do a lot of training and education. We have a ton of webinar material available free and online through our website, both live presentations that we do on a regular basis, much like our counterparts here. And we have a very large library as well that are available on demand through our website. So if there's any listeners out there want to access some of that, it's freely available. And there also may be insights for those of you wanting to do business in Canada that could be useful to your business development. And connections. So we are part of this World Trade Center network, 300 plus counterparts. It's how do we help link up and promote and facilitate trade. So we do so in partnership with the province of Manitoba, where they're called their strategic partner for trade. So kind of a lead trade agency to do trade and export development with the province of Manitoba, and also partner with our federal government around some of our small business programming. So in my role, one of the things I'm looking at on a regular basis are some of these bigger trends, like what's happening at the big picture in the global economy. And these are a handful of issues that we're seeing and kind of setting some of the context. And we're dealing with the global pandemic that has impacts on the economy and trade, but climate change being one of these issues that I've been given some particular attention to. As I mentioned, I became rather fascinated by this question or aspects of it, and what does it all mean for us? On the business and financial sector perspective, it's increasingly been identified as a risk to business and to the economy. Bank of Canada is the equivalent of the US Federal Reserve, so overseeing our monetary system. And Mark Carney is a name you may recognize. He was a longtime former governor of the Bank of Canada and more recently of the Bank of England. Somebody who's been for a long time trying to raise awareness about the risks of all this to the financial system. So we see it from a number of institutions, business sector kind of issues that are more and more and higher on the agenda. It's useful to remind ourselves when we talk about climate change to just remember a couple fundamentals in terms of what people are talking about in this space. It's good to have that frame of reference. And so it has to do with the emission of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, et cetera, that are produced, accumulating in the atmosphere. And really, I think this one illustrates that it's really linked to a lot of how the economy functions, industry to agriculture, transportation, energy, the fuels we're producing those excess emissions, greenhouse gas. We hear this language of emissions, talking about it more. And leading to this type of phenomenon of global temperature rise. That's what they call the global warming. Basically, the idea is that the gas traps the heat that warms the planet. And it's had effects on climate, weather, environment, in terms of both extreme weather and for changing weather patterns that might affect us. So you can think of longer periods of drought or dry conditions, longer heat waves, less cold weather in winter. And Winnipeg, we saw that this year. It's one of the mildest winters I've ever seen. We're due north of, more or less due north of St. Louis, known affectionately, or sometimes not so affectionately, as Winterpeg. We've got a reputation for long, cold winters, but very, very mild one here. I haven't really seen that too much before. So it's that extreme and changing weather patterns that are evidence. So things like hurricanes, wildfires, tsunamis, which is sort of growing in intensity and extremity, and having impacts on things that affect the economy in terms of construction, rebuilding, costs. You can take a look into the insurance industry, for example, for a sense of the costs around some of this stuff, and then the types of infrastructure that are associated and necessary for the good functioning of the economy. So our transportation infrastructure, our power infrastructure, and things like that, which are critical and obviously cost a lot to repair and to ensure that they're resilient for potentially future extreme weather and other sorts of risks. At the business or the company level, and those exporting, importing, engaged in international trade, this may translate into supply chain risk. Could there be disruptions to your transport, to getting your goods, to where are you sourcing some product from? Are the factories that you source from perhaps in low-lying or flood-prone areas, or at risk of future tsunamis type of incidents? And the pandemic, I think, has illustrated certain vulnerabilities in global supply chains and how they may be apt to disruption. So if your business is relying on these, or you're planning in terms of your expansion or going abroad, it's things you definitely want to be mindful of. And that's one layer of risk, kind of that environmental, the physical risks that I think the CEO wants to have in mind in terms of planning out the strategy. There's also other things happening that are not related to kind of the physical environment, but it's the global policy directions. Where are our national governments and countries steering things, and what's the behavior of countries, companies, investors, et cetera, in response to climate change? And this is something we also want to take note of. So the Paris Agreement is one that got a lot of press. This is the global agreement, goes back to 2015 when kind of all countries came together to make an agreement of we're going to collaborate and we're going to start working and setting plans and targets for how we're all going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in our different markets. So you see from the green, it's virtually covering the globe and in some fashion. These are multilateral agreements. They tend to be clunky, and there's lots of politics that goes on and how they are formed and come together. But at the end of the day, there has been this agreement to start setting the agenda of where we want our economies to go by lowering emissions. That, therefore, those types of policy directions can have impacts on the economy and hence on implications for international trade. And of course, with the United States, with President Biden has declared their intention to fully re-engage on this and actually sort of raise the ante, it sounds like, from some of the news around this. Related to the Paris Accord and the international agreements was this report that came out from a thing called the IPCC, or the International Panel on Climate Change. This is the scientific body that works with the UN and kind of represents the scientific consensus around this. And this number of 1.5 degrees is often cited as a target. That was part of what Paris said. We should try to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. Idea that help us avoid the worst effects of what global warming could bring on. That's the idea. So you hear this 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. We'll have to ask me later on the translation to Fahrenheit. I want to say it's 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, I guess. But these were the two kind of key bullet points that came out of it, and some dates that are often cited. So again, these are reference points to know, like, if you hear this a lot in the language and policy that are being set against these types of targets, it's coming out of these agreements. So what it says is that by 2030, we actually need to collectively, globally, reduce emissions by 45%, or basically cut them in half by the end of the decade, in just under 9 years now. It's big. It's a big target. And then to get to this thing called net zero by 2050, so within about 30 years. And that's the whole intent of what these Paris Accords and what these policy directions are starting to say. So you can imagine that's going to have trickle-down effects on the economy and on business. And that's the thing we're talking about. It's important to watch that. And of course, this was in the report as well, sort of the failure to do so, we're kind of reiterating the risk and possible effects if we don't get it under control. So a definitional piece, this net zero economy, is language that this concept of net zero, you'll hear about it more and more if you look into this. It's the idea of ensuring that there's a balance between the emissions that are produced by all the different forms of industry we saw, and emissions that are being pulled out of the atmosphere. So through things like forests and oceans and mangroves and soil, there's ways that it's pulled out. So it's getting to that balance where emissions are not rising, and then in theory, the temperature is not rising as well. It's a whole lot of language around this, carbon neutral, low carbon economy, decarbonization, sustainability and sustainable development is kind of related. So it's a bit of a wild west in terms of some of the language. net zero is increasingly the reference, and you'll see companies and countries are talking about that. And so related to those goals kind of being set through a Paris Accord and these international agreements are tools and policy instruments that are being put in place in different markets, such as carbon pricing or a carbon tax or a carbon levy is different words that have been used. But the whole idea is if you produce emissions, there will be a fee or a tax or a levy imposed on this, sends a price signal into the market, so to encourage or incent behavior to go towards low emission technologies and choices. Those that use pay, and therefore that helps steer behavior, but also possibly creates revenue or tax revenue that governments can use to invest in clean options. That's kind of generally how that works. Canada has a carbon pricing system and actually just went through a rather notable Supreme Court challenge. Was this constitutional for the federal government to do this? And it was deemed yes, it was upheld. So they're going to continue moving forward on that. And many industries support the approach as well in terms of having a steady, predictable way to plan for these things going forward. This is a newer issue that's creeping up into trade talks and to trade policy planning. It's this idea of carbon border tariffs. So what this refers to is that we say, okay, let's say in the United States, we're going to work on reducing emissions from key sectors. And there's some that are much more challenging to do so in things like, say, steel production. They use a lot of energy, right? It's kind of hard to abate that or hard to bring that down. But if we say, okay, we're committed to this goal and we're going to invest in the technologies, we're going to work with our industry, we're going to start to transition on that process. Well, there's costs associated with doing that. And sort of who bears that cost and that risk? So the idea with the border tariff, a carbon tariff, is that if we're committing to this, then we may want to look at putting up a tariff so that if there's similar product coming from another market, doesn't have the same standards on emissions, is not going through the same process, therefore not, absorbing the same cost, well, then they'll face a tariff at the border so we can ensure our industry stays healthy and competitive. So it's just an interesting dynamic from a trade policy perspective, because now all of a sudden we're starting to see, potential application of tariffs being applied in response to climate goals. So I'd say that's new, and that's something to look at, maybe what's happening domestically, but also if you're thinking from a company, if you're an exporter, are there market access issues? Am I going to meet the standards of the market that I'm going in? And do I also have to now compete, not only just on my price, the quality, my product, but do I also have to compete on being clean and my carbon footprint? Maybe. That's the thing to watch. We also see it in the discussions, the bilateral question in Canada-US. This was the face-to-face in our pandemic world, the first meeting with President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau shortly after coming into office. And what came out of that first meeting was this roadmap for a Canada-US partnership. So these are the 6 key points that they've agreed to work on. And the 2 that I've highlighted in orange here, this idea of building back better and accelerating climate ambitions, are both specifically related to this whole climate action question. So building back better is, the response out of COVID. What are we doing to the economy? What's our stimulus going to look like? How are we going to support industry? And should we be orienting towards, clean, sustainable, low emissions technologies? If we're doing all this investment, let's build towards that. That's the build back better idea, as opposed to business as usual, more polluting business, cleaner going forward. That's the idea. And of course, to accelerate, the other about explicitly accelerating climate ambitions, or raise our objectives, set higher targets at things like Paris and in the international environment. So definitely something we're both going to be seeing on both sides of the border going forward. So that's a few thoughts on the policy environment and then directions. But then there's some market dynamics as well that factor into this. And I'll just run through a few of them quickly. There's the consumer angle. What are your customers? What are the consumer market looking at? How are these tendencies in changing in response? Are people more concerned? Are they changing their consumption patterns by it? Are you affected by that? Will you be? Is there an opportunity for you to develop something new in response to that as well? The youth, this whole movement sort of captured a lot of global attention, certainly pre-pandemic when people used to meet in groups like this. But the youth certainly came out in force to protest this global movement, these Friday strikes. But it certainly captivated media attention. It got in front of some of the higher levels of things like World Economic Forum and some of those policy circles. And it touched people's and families as well, because it was now the youth, people's children, their grandchildren were out on the streets and bringing it into the household and say, we've got to do more, we got to do better, we're angry. That was that movement. But I don't think that's entirely gone away. I think that it's less prevalent with COVID. But these are future consumers. These are future employees and workforce. And what are their values? And are you attractive to them as future employers, as investors, as voters? What's that impact going to be? And how does your business model kind of intersect with that? Are you going to be an employer of choice for these folks, or not? So these are, again, things to be aware of. And it links into this idea of like the branding and the reputation of your business. How does your brand fare in a world that's increasingly concerned by things like climate change? Certain industries we know have come under the microscope. Fracking has always been a hot button issue. But the fashion industry has come under the microscope, and others. Like, what are the practices you're using? What's your environmental footprint? What are corporations doing? So that's related. And similarly, litigation related to climate issues has risen. This is the past. This is going up to 2016, but you can see a rise in that, of groups looking to stop different projects, prevent different projects, move things going forward. And so those may or may not be related to business issues, but again, things to be aware of at the strategic level. Investors increasingly talking about how they want to be shifting towards cleaner portfolios and doing their part. And this, we're seeing a lot of kind of corporate engagement on this. And I'm going to touch on that in a few ways now. Supply chains. Carbon neutral supply chains are something we're hearing more and more about. And there was news last year, Microsoft kind of made some headlines in talking about their pledge and commitment, and said, we're not just going to be carbon neutral or net zero, we're going to be carbon negative. That means we're going to take all the carbon that we've historically ever produced and offset that amount back to the time of our founding as a company. So we're going to kind of set the bar up here and try to lead on this. And so there's more and more companies doing similar, making these types of pledges and commitments of like, how are we going to change our operations? But a thing to pick up on, for the small and medium-sized business, is you look in the finer print about how they plan to achieve some of this, or a lot of this, is through the supply chain. And so what it essentially means is there are certain things they can do within their operations. Let's get electric fleets. How we purchase our power. So, okay, they're gonna commit to purchasing renewable energy. And I just saw news that Amazon became the largest renewable energy purchaser in Europe now through their company. Those types of commitments. But the biggest way is through the supply chain, through a thing called Scope 3 emissions. And business owners, your ears should perk up, I think, when you hear, corporations, specifically their customers, talking about Scope 3 emissions, because that effectively is their supply chain. What are we purchasing from, and what is the carbon footprint of our suppliers? So the way we're going to get there to the tune of 70 to even 80% in a lot of cases of companies is through the supply chain. So that'll be an issue to be aware of as well. This is just these are new preferences of potential customers. And do we sell to those supply chains? Do we want to be part of those supply chains? Are we positioned as leaders to be attractive to those supply chains? That's how some of this is translating in response to this whole carbon neutral piece. So there's a variety of corporate engagement. There's different organizations that are popping up. These are all kind of US-based groups and international that are starting to amass significant capital and represent a large chunk of the economy, all making various commitments of being carbon neutral. And the last one, this group called Ceres, these are institutional investors and asset managers. 54 trillion in combined assets, committing to saying we're going to build net zero portfolios. So what we invest in, the companies we choose to invest in, we're going to be looking at those standards. So capital moving in that direction. I spent the better part of last week in an event called Globe Finance in up in Canada, virtually from the same office here. But it was all talking about this, and it was all talking about this transition, and he was bringing together major investors and pension fund investors and public and private sector, all looking at how do we get there, how do we get to net zero, how do we deploy capital, and definitely a sense that this is really top of mind for a lot of leading corporations and investors in capital. So this idea that the transition is underway, and that in fact kind of the avant-garde are out there using this as a driver for innovation, competitiveness, growth, and looking for new business models and looking to be the leaders of that and capture market share along the way and capture value for their companies. Such that this race to zero has become something we're seeing. This is actually a real-time campaign that's going on, spearheaded by the United Nations and kind of under that whole framework of getting towards Paris Accord. They're trying to raise commitments going into this fall, which is the next thing called the Conference of the Party, or COP26, 26th time they meet. And so this is the annual reunion, if you will, of the Paris Accord partners to kind of check in and say, where are we at? And can we raise our game and let's show off our commitments. UK is hosting, and they're again trying to take a leadership position. So this is cities, this is regions, this is also business, but it's trying to take some of that leadership position of like, hey, we want to be the most attractive jurisdiction for trade and investment. You should come here because we're the most climate friendly, clean power, we're doing all those things. And part of it is, yes, to do that for the environmental benefit, but also it's because we want to be attracting that investment. We want to be the leaders in that area. And so we're going to position ourselves in such a way that we're better situated to attract the capital of the future. So that's some of the dynamics that are going on, which I find this stuff fascinating to see where it's going. But then opportunities, right? So we've kind of touched on some of the risks on the physical stuff, some of these different dynamics, or even called transition risks, and what's associated to how the economy is shifting. There's a big opportunity picture as well. So I just want to highlight some things to think about that, and where's the opportunity for the business community. That's part of our job, is to help our companies find and develop and pursue those opportunities, and ideally export as well, and solutions. So this is a key question that is really often asked of kind of a best practice in business and business planning. So what problem are you solving for your customer? Right? So if you're looking at business planning, lean business model canvas, all these tools, what's the problem you're solving for your customer? Well, the good news around climate change is that there's a lot of things that need solving. So if the stated goal is to reduce emissions in every sector, to get levels down, decarbonize across the economy at scale, there's a need for solutions. And so it's talked about in trillions. And this is the clean tech market, clean technology, things that have that type of impact to get us there. These are some numbers. I'm sure this is much larger now. It's gone up, but if you look at the applications across the different sectors of the economy, and this is some of Canada's emissions profile, if you will, what's causing in different sectors. So from oil and gas and transport, like who's producing what. You can see all of these are looking for those types of solutions. So if you have product, technologies, innovations in these areas, huge markets you can imagine domestically and internationally as well. So I won't dwell too much on the opportunity side, but it's big. It's being cited as big. So there's a lot of ways to pursue business. But kind of thinking about all that, I talked about the risks and the opportunity and what does the business owner do, and came up with this acronym called, to SWOT the pest, and to look at some tools, because we don't just want to talk about trends. We want to have, okay, what are some tools that we can use to apply to our business going forward? And so SWOT, this is the classic SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats. I'd argue it still very much applies. It's just a matter of understanding what are some of these variables and trends and thinking through each of these, how this applies to our business, and making sure it's on the radar screen. And that's part of our goal in raising awareness, is to just make sure these issues are on your radar screen. Have you done some assessment? Are you at risk anywhere, or do you have new opportunities that you can pursue? And the pest, so SWOT to the pest, I'll admit the analogy broke down a little bit. It's a pestle analysis, so there's actually 6 things: political, economic, social, then the environmental, and the legal. But it's kind of systematically taking a 360 around your company and looking at each of those areas for the risks and the opportunities. 2, pretty fundamental pieces that have been long time incorporated into business plans still apply, but just look at be aware of the dynamics that are going on out there. And then there's more. Like, this is a group, Euromonitor International is a research source that we use quite a bit to assist our clients and to get market analysis, talking about things like this mega trend analysis that highlighted at the beginning, those big global trends going on. So how do we identify and prioritize those that are most relevant to my business and incorporate that into strategy? But I think a key is that it's about having that strategy, putting this kind of lens on it to be aware of these different dynamics that are going on, and think about it at the boardroom level, like at the CEO level, at the director's level, because it's looking ahead and where are things going to be in 5, 10, and 15 years, and am I positioned to be set up? And what does all this mean? So it's building into that core business strategy. So that's a key message, and with this lens on. I'll share a couple resources. We can touch on these more in the Q&A, but our partners locally at the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a global organization headquartered out of Winnipeg, developed this great climate action toolkit. So if you need a starter or some primers, how do I even get started on this? I've shared a lot of information, but how do I actually start to apply it? That's a toolkit you can start to look at, and it's available online, and we had some input on that. And then a couple of weeks ago, we did a webinar on getting to net zero. So an overview of some very practical things and frameworks that companies can look at, not just how do I get a handle on kind of measuring my footprint and what are tools, but the business case and how companies are really gaining value and market share and branding enhancements. And there's all kinds of benefits that they're realizing of those that are kind of going through this assessment process and starting to track and measure. And one like science-based targets that a lot of corporate majors are using as a bit of a global standard in terms of how you look at it, but they've got great tools and resources for actually getting, actually starting to look at this and some how-to stuff. And if you engage with a group like that, they actually can escort you right through the process and assist. So I'm gonna stop there. We're gonna only shift into the Q&A part of it. If you're new to any of this stuff, like there's a lot of information. I get that, and it's you feel like you're drinking from the fire hose. So certainly happy to have a bit of a discussion here, and look forward to some questions. And I'll say thank you again for the opportunity to share some of this. And I'll stop sharing my screen and come back here. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Derek. That was a very, very comprehensive overview. So thank you for that. And I think we do have a translation on the 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we ended up with 34.7 Fahrenheit. So a little bit over freezing there. So that's the calculation. So I think just a reminder for your, if you do want to pose any questions, please do so in the Q&A, and we'll get right started. We have some coming in as we speak. So first question from Christopher: how did the USMCA address climate change, if at all?
That's a good question. That is one I'll admit I'll have to take a deeper look into the specifics of climate change. I know that increasingly with trade agreements, there's been more of a focus on other things such as environmental and labor standards. And probably maybe the key thing to focus on goes back to the slide I mentioned earlier with this Canada-US roadmap. So this is sort of setting some of the higher level objectives, bilateral objectives between Canada and the US under the new administration, and what are some of the priorities we're going to focus on. And through that, the cooperation around things related to climate action and to kind of promoting green economy opportunities has been identified as a priority on both sides. So I think we expect to see that kind of factoring into the trade relationship at that level. And one area that's going to be interesting to watch in this is something like the automotive sector, right? This is one that you've seen a lot now. Groups like all the major vehicle producers, GM and others, are talking about going to electric, and by mid 2035 or next 10, 15 years, kind of phasing out gas-powered vehicles. The Super Bowl commercial, the Will Ferrell one, that was pretty hilarious. Talking about competing around this and those commitments. But supply chains being very integrated and very linked between Canada and the US. So how is that going to factor into the opportunities for this cross-border integrated supply chain in pursuing these new types of technologies? That's something I think we'll be watching pretty closely on both sides of the borders. There's a lot of trade is done in those sectors, and most of it's related to kind of internal supply chain integration.
Great, thanks so much, Derek. Yeah, I know from our end, I don't believe there was a lot of provision for climate change in the USMCA either. Although I have heard that FTAs and bilateral FTAs, I guess, as we move away from those plurilateral agreements, may be a forum going forward for some climate action.
Well, one that we saw, one that we saw that has maybe been noted to go the farthest in terms of incorporating some of those considerations is the CPTPP. So that was the one with the Americas and the Asia Pacific region. Canada signed on. The US is not currently signed on to that, but that has some provisions in there. I think some of the more robust ones.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, another question from Betsy. The Midwest grows corn and soybeans. The Winnipeg region grows soybeans and oats. When do you expect to see the northern shift of crops and climate migrants moving north in the middle of our continent and changing weather patterns? And will Canada benefit from this move?
That's another great question. That's an illustration of the way, if climate evolves the way scientists are forecasting based on all this, how does it start to affect what we do, what we grow, what we produce in our regions? So, you're highlighting that there's, potential risks to crops that are, you produce there, corn and soybean. I can tell you already there's been we produce a lot of soybeans now. That's been a growing area because it's identified as the crops that could potentially benefit more in warmer weather. Same thing with corn. There's a local institute here called the Prairie Climate Center, has a data map, and they've done some very detailed modeling that shows kind of what we can expect in this region. It actually has it for all of Canada. But one of the conclusions at a high level is that the prediction is that if things sort of carry on the trajectory business as usual path here, that within a span of less than 30 years, Winnipeg, with our winter climates and our cold weather, is going to have a climate equivalent to that of northern Texas. Which means there's some unpredictable variables into what that means for growing, but I would agree that there's the ag sector here is looking at what does that mean for opportunities and shifting, and will more arable land be opened up further north? We don't really know. Those are big transformative questions that we don't quite know about, but it is the type of question that our industry here is posing, that's for sure.
All right, great, thank you. Another question from Andrew. How does a business owner go about measuring their carbon footprint to determine whether it is even a concern or an issue that they might want to address?
That's a great question, and this is the type of question I think a lot of business owners are starting to face and want to get a handle on. We're not in that business. We don't advise companies on how to do that. We're looking at more of the strategy as it relates to the policy environment and business opportunities. But a couple of the resources I mentioned in the presentation, we can share this. Our webinar on getting to net zero, which you'll be able to download through our website, does a nice kind of detailed presentation onto that sort of very questions, some of the tools, some of the things you look at, fundamentals of things you wanted to start measuring, tracking, and how. And that Science-Based Targets is that other organization. It's an NGO. They've got some good how-to kind of tools, primers to get started if you want to start to figure that stuff out. But there's no real global standards yet, so there's still a wild west in that whole arena, but that's one that a lot of corporate majors are going to, so it may become something of a standard. That's possible. But those would be two great starting points to take a look at.
Absolutely. Thank you, Derek. Another question from Renee. In Texas, the US, there is a lot of fracking. What is the impact on the world climate change?
Well, the data around climate change, kind of sources of greenhouse gas and emissions, the most prevalent ones being CO2 and methane are two of the most common. There's others, that are used in industrial processes and refrigeration and things. Those are some of the big ones. And the biggest sectors globally that cause the most emissions is the fossil fuel sector. So the burning of coal, the burning of oil, and burning of gas at different levels and different amounts. With fracking, so it's producing an oil or a gas product. Natural gas burns cleaner than something like coal and various diesel and oil. But associated with fracking is often the process and methane that gets flared off. So it's not necessarily captured, it's burned. And if you've seen the pump jacks in the wells, they're in southern Manitoba, they're in lots of Canada, they're in North Dakota, they're in Texas. Those wells and those pump jacks, they're flaring it and burning it off the top. That's burning methane. And all that methane is going straight into the atmosphere. So that's where some of the big impacts around that. And I know those industries tend to be working hard, especially in Canada. They're trying to capture that and remove or reduce that portion of it. But globally, it's then the end use product burning of those products that also is part of the equation. So they're definitely in terms of the sources, they're big ones globally.
All right, and the questions are coming in. Hale and hearty, this is great. One idea for small or medium-sized businesses, Climate Smart Businesses Inc. has a software tool, training and coaching to train up key staff within businesses. And it is all in accordance with the GHG protocol, the most recognized international standard in carbon accounting, used by the majority of Fortune 500 businesses. So not really a question there, more of a comment, but
if I can add on that comment, the webinar I mentioned on getting to net zero featured a presenter on the Climate Smart program. That's one in pretty wide use and very accessible to SMEs in Canada. So I suspect that might be the group that's tuned into this as well. So thank you for that and the plug. But yeah, so that's kind of featured and some very practical illustrations of how companies can apply, what it sort of means, but also, as I said, the benefits and business case that companies are finding as well. It's like there's just good business reasons in a lot of cases to do this. The other things aside.
Indeed, absolutely. So, and I'm gonna allude here for a little minute to something you already referenced, Eric. As we speak, President Biden is convening a virtual leaders summit today on climate and has unveiled, as you mentioned, the partnership roadmap with Prime Minister Trudeau, referencing the Building Back Better and the accelerating climate ambitions as explicit provisions. How do you see this new policy translating for businesses?
Well, I think as I tried to kind of touch on the importance of these higher level policy directions in terms of this shift towards the economy, because really what's behind is, okay, they're setting targets to say, okay, we want to do more to tackle climate change, we want to do more to lower emissions, but it's tied to the economy, right? So if they're really talking about changing practices at a large scale across the economy, decarbonizing every industry and finding tools or incentives or regulations or other policies intended to kind of get us toward that goal, that's going to trickle down, right? And those are some of the things that, those are behaviors, those are policy decisions that can have impact on my business. Do I have to change my own practices for regulatory reasons? Do I have to change just because for competitive reasons? Because my competitors are, so do I need to keep up with them? Does it affect how well my product can be sold in the other markets? Like I think if Europe goes, let's say if Europe is in the fast lane, which they kind of are on this, and they go ahead, but you want to continue to sell your product, to start to export your product there, do you meet the new thresholds that are being set in the targets? Is your product clean enough? emissions free enough, to be competitive? And if not, why would they buy from you? Like those are, I think, some of the types of questions and the practical things that are going to start to drill back down to the business owner.
Totally agree that market access and regulations, absolutely, those will definitely come into play.
The supply chain piece as well. If major buyers are insisting that their supply chains be carbon neutral, are you selling to them? Do you want to be selling to them? And if so, are you attractive and competitive to be part of that?
Indeed, supply chain always front and center there for sure. Another question on carbon tariffs. Do you think carbon tariffs will be an addendum to current free trade agreements in the near future, or a standard addition in future agreements?
I think that's some of the open question around this. What we're seeing is more discussion around these policies. Initially more so in Europe the last couple of years, talking about their kind of European Green New Deal. They were talking about these types of concepts, and associated to that of like, how do we ensure we protect our domestic industries as we decarbonize from competition from lower sources? So I think policymakers at the highest levels are looking at that. I think it's still open-ended and to what extent those get incorporated, adopted, and or harmonized in some way. But I know I talked recently to a senior VP with the Canadian Chambers of Commerce, right? So the equivalent of your American Chambers of Commerce, the umbrella organization, and was referencing that there's ongoing right now some very high-level discussions between these groups of trying to, how do we navigate this? How do we kind of maybe harmonize what the approach is going to be? How do we shape what that's going to look like going forward? So it's still a bit unknown, but it's on the agenda is what it seems to be.
Absolutely. And of course, we have smaller countries like New Zealand, for example, with their 5-country coalition, and South Korea making inroads as well. So absolutely, that is something we need to keep an eye on. So another question, can you elaborate a little on climate action as a driver of innovation and growth? You alluded to this a little bit in your presentation, but what are the opportunities, I guess, for companies going forward?
There's maybe two ways you can think about this, and some very broad categories. So I apologize if I'm being oversimplistic in this, but if the move is to try to get towards this idea of net zero and decarbonize economies and reduce emissions, then we need solutions and technologies, and there's a big technology play in this. So innovating for technologies that can help get us there, so that can, the way we build our buildings, how we produce our energy, how we monitor our energy, to insulation products, to there's a to how agricultural practices, to things like precision agricultures, to electrifying all the fleets in the business. Local company just started up a courier company, first one in Winnipeg, a zero emissions courier, bought an electric car, doing small packages, market leader, first one got it out there. So there's those technologies and processes that can get us there, right? So if everyone's agreeing we got to get there, we don't necessarily know how we're going to get there, so we need solutions. So therefore, if you can develop the solutions to design, to do that, to get us there, those are going to be big market opportunities, because every market is going to need those, right? That's why it's in the trillions and trillions that we're talking about. What does that climate tech market look like? It's vast. Digitization, it can relate to it, right? And provided it's kind of produced by clean power, like the powering the digital infrastructure, but things that are reducing the use for travel and for paper and for consumption of resources, it can enable in those ways. You don't want your data center powered by coal. That offsets it in the wrong way. But so there's that. But then there's also thinking about what are the businesses and business models that will operate in a low carbon economy. So there's the ones that will get us there, and what operates in that. And we've seen tremendous drivers of economic activity around like creative and cultural and knowledge industry and design, things that can use like virtual technology, can operate globally, can do so with very small corporate footprints, but create a lot of economic value.
Yeah, that's an interesting point on the knowledge economy. Of course, we can't forget that when it comes to the
a lot of services are like that as well. There's companies here that are doing virtual reality development and tools and stuff. They're exploding right now. Well, COVID drove a lot of that as well. But the same things apply to solutions that help kind of reduce the overall business related impact of of conducting your business. So.
Absolutely, great point. A recent report by Fitch Solutions on megatrends in a post-COVID world identified the transition to a low-carbon economy as being among the most disruptive economic trends to 2013. So how can companies best prepare for such an eventuality?
I think it starts with that, kind of starting to get some of that climate lens. So one of my later slides showed on is, right now it's getting these issues on the radar screen and make sure you're doing it at the at the ownership and the boardroom level and the CEO level to start factoring this stuff into long-term strategy. So I mean, play it forward in terms of a scenario that, like, let's assume that the global community comes together, gets it right, achieves their objectives, and lowers global emissions by 50% in 9 years. That's some massive transformation into how we do things and how we produce things and how we consume things, right? So I think it's getting a handle on it. What does it mean for your company, and starting to think about your business model and how your business model fits into a low carbon economy. Because it seems to be moving that way, and faster or slower, how fast and how successful, but the trends definitely seem to be that there's consensus that countries around the world are gonna steer this process and get it going, and backed by a lot of corporations and capital and things like that are moving in support. Seems early stages, but you certainly get like the poor business owner. I mean, if you didn't have enough issues to deal with and things you have to consider, now you also kind of have to consider this. But I think there's a lot of good business and competitive reasons why you want to be aware of it.
Absolutely, and always better to be prepared than to find yourself on the other end there.
That's right. Yeah.
I think we have time to squash in one final question here. We get lots of questions from the audience. In addition to climate change mitigation strategies such as GHG emissions reduction, are you seeing examples of businesses adapting to the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, I find both conversations are really happening in parallel right now between what's called the mitigation of, like, what are we doing to kind of like reduce gas? Can we stop making this problem worse by getting a handle on global emissions? But then now, how do we adapt? Same, climate change is here. Like, it's changing now. Like the weather is like it's weird. It's destable. It's more extreme. Like, this stuff is all happening right now, and there's a big cost on the economy to that. So how do we start to prepare? Like, how are cities and municipalities starting to factor this into infrastructure planning? Or is our infrastructure up to the task? Is our building locations? Are we taking where are we going to put in future greenfield investments? Are we looking at all those types of things? So I think you are starting to see that creep in more and more. And again, like, some are, the early adopters are already kind of well down this road. Have been doing those assessments and starting to figure out how they manage and safeguard their infrastructure. And others, I think, maybe only just starting to realize that this is maybe something they need to think about.
Absolutely, and we are to time. So thank you so much, Derek. That was very comprehensive. You've given us certainly a lot to think about. And swat the pestle. Gotta remember that. Swat the pestle. Start with that. I want to thank you all, our attendees as well, for taking the time to join us today. Merci bien à tout le monde au Canada aussi. And don't forget to join us next month on Wednesday, May 26th, for another event in the series, this time Beyond COVID, Making Sense of the New Realities. And that will be with David George of London-based Global Data. So we will include, there have been some questions about copies of the presentation, and lots of praise from colleagues as well for you, Derek, here, which we'll share with you afterwards. But for the attendees, there will be a follow-up email, most likely on Monday. You'll see a recording of the presentation, and also an 8 Earth Day tips, which the World Trade Center in Winnipeg released today in tandem with a press release on our event here. So we will include those as well, and a few of the links that Derek referenced during the presentation. So again, thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe, and we will see you next month. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you all.